Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine's Zoominar producer, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program, From Folktales and Fables to Harry Potter, Yiddish Storytelling for a New Generation. Today's session is being recorded. Please type your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible at the end of the session. Following today's program, please visit Moment's website, where you will find a variety of articles on Yiddish. Be sure to register for next week's Zoominar, What to Do About Anti-Semitism and Racism, with Eric K. Ward. This event is a tribute to the memory of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Now for today's program. Sarah Breger is Deputy Editor of Moment Magazine and Director of the Daniel Pearl Investigative Initiative. Sarah has won numerous awards, including first place for Religion Reporting of the Year from the Religion News Association, and first place for Best In-Depth News Writing on Religion from the American Academy of Religion. Miriam Udel is Associate Professor of German Studies and Jewish Studies at Emory University. Her academic research interests include 20th century Yiddish literature and culture, Jewish children's literature, and the American Jewish literature. She is the author of Never Better, The Modern Jewish Picaresque, which was a winner of the 2017 National Jewish Book Award in Modern Jewish Thought and Experience. Her latest book is Honey on the Page, a treasury of Yiddish children's literature. Arun Viswanath grew up in Teaneck, New Jersey, in a trilingual home. Although he grew up speaking Yiddish with family members and the broader New York Yiddish scene, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stones marks his first foray into Yiddish translation. He also recently completed a translation of a Faroese children's book about a puffin expecting a younger sibling, which should be available this summer. Please welcome Sarah Breger, Miriam Udel, and Arun Viswanath.
Thank you. Thanks, Suzanne, and thank you for helping to organize this. I am very excited about this discussion. It hits, I think, all of my sweet spots. I was a kid when, Harry Potter first came out, and I'm part of that Potter mania millennial group. I even hosted a live reading of a Harry Potter play when it came out a few years ago. So Arun, this is real catnip for me. And I spent the weekend reading Honey on the Page, and it's such a rich collection. It actually reminded me of so many of the stories I read growing up, especially the Chalm ones. And it also reminded me of how sly and funny Yiddish stories can be. So I really enjoyed that. So thank you for that. In some ways, the two of you are approaching this topic of modern Yiddish storytelling from opposite angles, translating a novel into Yiddish, translating stories from Yiddish into English. But I think there's a lot of overlapping themes, and also in how you guys approach the subjects. So, but before we kind of talk about the subject at hand, the kind of modern Yiddish children's literature, let's just go kind of to the history a little bit. Arun, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the role of translation in Yiddish literature.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I'm so excited to be here in conversation with you and with Miriam. So Yiddish literature and even the Yiddish language itself is deeply connected with translation from the very beginning, and we still feel its echoes today. In its earlier stages, the language was actually called Yiddish which literally meant Jewish German, and it played for Ashkenazi Jews a complementary role to Hebrew, which was the holy tongue. And so it functioned not only as the day-to-day vernacular of these Jews, but specifically in the context of the cheder, the schoolhouse for young boys, where it was used to teach the text of the Torah through word-by-word translation. Although the term Yiddish was shortened such that the language came to be referred to in modern times simply as Yiddish, the second half of that term, Teich, continued to describe the practice of literal translating of the holy texts. And that found its written form in an important piece of Yiddish literature, the Teich Chumash, the 5 books of Moses translated into Yiddish. Interestingly, many of you may know that there was a phrase with which Shakespeare's works in Yiddish were supposedly promoted in the early 20th century as verteidigt and verbessert, meaning literally translated and improved. So that the echoes of that term Teich continue to be felt today as well. But beyond the Teichchomich itself, the translation of the 5 books of Moses, there was also the Tzenereno, which was first published in the early 17th century and actually still popular today. The Tzenerena is a moralizing collection of, shall we say, adaptation of the Medrash, rabbinic exegesis on the text of the Torah, which is translated into Yiddish and intended to be read in conjunction with or in place of the weekly Torah portion that was read weekly in the synagogue. And although the Tzenerena is often referred to as the women's Chumash, it appears that this work was really widely in circulation among men as well, since only a subset of men were literate enough to follow along in the Hebrew. So you had a large portion of the population reading essentially literature, in this case, the holy texts, in translation from a very early age. But it wasn't only religious literature that Jews were reading in Yiddish translation. As a matter of fact, that Tzenerena itself was in part a response to the popularity of a wide variety of non-religious literature that was available in Yiddish already in the 14th and 15th centuries. Even works such as the Shmuel Buch and the Maaseh Buch, literally the Book of Samuel and the Book of Stories, which for the most part did deal with religious themes and characters from the Bible, even these were recognizably European in their structure and even in their meter, and they took the form of chivalric romances. The best known work of Old Yiddish literature within the genre is the Bava Buch, and that's actually a translation and an adaptation of the Anglo-Norman romance of Beavis of Hampton, or in Italian, Buovo d'Antona. And you may think that you've maybe never heard of this work, but actually the Bava Buch, which was wildly popular, later came to be known simply as the Bava Maisa, the story of Buovo, and eventually morphed in modern Yiddish into the term Baba Maisa, which many of you may know as the Yiddish term for a tall tale. And that really just brings us into the modern times, or shall we say the second half of the 19th century, where we see the emergence of modern Yiddish literature in the trifecta of Shalom Aleichem, Mendel Moiches Farim, and Yudlam and Peretz. And of course, I'm generalizing a little bit for the purposes of time here. These writers were producing original works of literature for what had grown to become a very large popular audience of Eastern European Jews for whom Yiddish was the main, or really their only spoken language. But this audience, finding itself in a time of unprecedented global connectivity and immigration, also found an appetite for non-Jewish world literature. Again, the same story repeating. And so the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century saw the translation into Yiddish of such varied classics as Tolstoy's War and Peace, Cervantes's Don Quixote, Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the aforementioned Shakespeare, and even more contemporary works like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which had broad circulation among Jews increasingly eager to learn of the worlds and cultures that lay outside the bounds of traditional Jewish life. But it was really in this time in the early 20th century that we also see original Yiddish literature starting to explore new audiences and genres beyond the aforementioned writers like Shalom Aleichem, in terms of the style and the aims of the literature in general. And I think this is where I would turn to Miriam to tell us about this.
So that is a great initial introduction, Arun, and it is such a pleasure to be in dialogue with you and with Sarah, and we're grateful to Moment Magazine for inviting us today. So indeed, the phenomenon of Yiddish children's literature really gathers steam at the turn of the 20th century, and particularly in the teens and 20s. And I want to flag two intertwined phenomena, two intertwined situations that really give rise to this body of work. One is the way that it interacts with the political life and the political visions that Yiddish speakers are pursuing both in Eastern Europe and in the Americas. It is a time of real ideological ferment when there were a lot of different competing ideas about what the optimal vision for the future might look like, and how Yiddish speakers, i.e. European Jews and Jews who had migrated from Europe, how they could be involved in these optimal political visions. So there was the idea of Zionism, that there should be a homeland for the Jewish people established in the ancient home of Eretz Israel. There was socialism, Bundism, the idea that workers across the globe needed to unite in addressing income inequality and other forms of inequality that went hand in hand with that. There was communism, which went so far as to believe that the primary important affiliation was by social class and economic status, rather than these kind of more provincial holdovers of religious or ethnic affiliation, so that Yiddish was a means because that was the language of the proletariat, but that the end didn't necessarily have to do with the preservation of Yiddish. The Yiddish could be harnessed to these other political goals. And of course, that's only in the camp of what we would broadly call the left. There are traditionalists of all different stripes who want to preserve a more robust understanding of Jewish practice and civilization and continue that into the future. So there are all of these different competing visions, and these result in the formation of political parties and in the formation of allied school systems that go along with these political parties in Warsaw and Vilna and in New York, and to a lesser extent in Montreal and Los Angeles and Detroit and Boston and in Chicago. So, and other places as well, right? So those schools need materials. They need educational materials for their students during the school day, and they also need leisure reading. And this really brings me to the second situation that I wanted to flag for you, which is that the political moment is very heated and exigent. And at the same time, we have a major shift in the broad social understanding of childhood itself. So if we hearken back to those earlier days that Arun was talking about, the stratification, the important stratification among readers wasn't between children and adults. It was between men with an elite education who would be expected to spend most of their time reading and discussing and arguing about texts that were written in Hebrew and Aramaic, and the women, and in the phrase that was current at the time, men who are like women in the sense that they lacked access to that elite halachic religious legal discourse. And those women and men who were like women, of course, had young children in their sphere. So the people who were reading the Tzenerena and the Bova Buch were assumed to be the non-elites. And then in the early decades of the 20th century, child psychology, what started out being called the child guidance movement, and what was known in the USSR as pedology or child science, starts to arise actually as a function of the justice system and the idea that children might not be fully formed and they might be more susceptible to reformation if they were showing criminal tendencies. And it was really important to establish a separate justice system and separate correctional institutions for children. And out of that cluster of ideas grows this broader movement toward child psychology. And then we start to see a really broadly conceived idea that children are different on the inside than adults. They're not just tiny little adults, and they thrive best when they have their own distinctive reading materials, both for educational purposes and to beguile their leisure time. And oh, by the way, there's more leisure time for more children after the Industrial Revolution. So there's a lot more history that we could unpack there. But I think the important thing to know about this body of literature that starts to be written for children in Yiddish is that it is efflorescing during this very moment that the idea of childhood itself is becoming really firmly established as a special, distinctive time of life and as a time when moral formation is really possible. And that all makes its way into what this literature looks and sounds like.
And was this popular in America as well, and not just in Eastern Europe?
Definitely. So a lot of the publishing activity that we see, even from early on in the 1920s, is taking place in New York. So it really starts in Europe. At first, books are not being written specifically for children. They're taking books with child protagonists by Sholem Aleichem, sometimes by Yod Lamed Peretz, and they are kind of retrofitting these stories by, so there's a child protagonist, and a very typical kind of a Sholem Aleichem plot is that the child will do something wrong. He'll bite the stem end of the etrog and invalidate the etrog, or he'll steal the penknife, or it'll be this or that. The child will do something, and then he'll have a terrible guilty conscience, and the drama is how the child reckons with that. And it's told, a lot of these stories are told in the first person by the adult remembering and tapping into the emotional world of the child. But Sholem Aleichem, being Sholem Aleichem, with a grave concern about economic inequality and the predations of the nouveau riche, et cetera, has these long perorations about wealth inequality. So if you're going to retrofit these as children's stories, you take out all of those boring parts and you insert a glossary at the bottom of every page or at the back of the book, and boom, it's a children's story, right? So they started out with adaptations, and it really took a couple of decades to get this idea going of writing distinctively, writing distinct stories that would be conceived of and marketed to and published for children.
I want to turn to both of your books because I feel like we can kind of get lost in like talking about Yiddish translations in general. Arun, can you tell me kind of what inspired you to embark on this journey of translating, the most popular children's book of all time?
So there's so many threads that Miriam raised that feed directly into how I experienced my childhood. And the primary one was really the kinds of reading materials that I had as a kid growing up speaking Yiddish. Of course, the background to how I was a kid outside of the Hasidic community growing up speaking Yiddish is a long one, but suffice it to say, one of the prevailing ideologies in the early 20th century in this tumult of political activity was Yiddishism, which saw Yiddish as an important and even fundamental piece of Jewish or Ashkenazi Jewish identity. And my great-grandfather and my grandfather and everybody down the line were ardent Yiddishists, and they continued passing the language down to their children and their children. And that's how I grew up speaking Yiddish. In the suburbs of New Jersey, no less. And so I always felt the lack of work in Yiddish that spoke to me because I sort of had four things available to me. One was, as Miriam so aptly described, adults telling stories as children in the first person, remembering what it was like to be a kid, which now when I read, I enjoy as an adult. But as a kid, I didn't really understand what was going on. And in retrospect, I fully understand why. There was and continues to be significant publishing activity from within the Hasidic communities, which one shouldn't discount. But at the same time, the subject matter of the children's books that come out of the Hasidic community in Yiddish tend to be explicitly moralizing and somewhat narrow in terms of their subject matter. Of course, there was the English literature that I had all around me. So I was a voracious reader of R.L. Stein's Goosebumps series and Mary Pope Osborne's The Magic Tree House, and of course, Harry Potter. There was this other stream of early 20th century literature written for children, some of the pieces of which I wish that I had had as a kid, in which I was able to find in Miriam's anthology, but some of which are a product of their time inevitably and didn't quite speak to me. And so I felt from a very early age, like, I wish that Yiddish had something that spoke to me as an American kid, which is a very selfish thing, but as these creative responses come, they tend to come from a personal need or a personal lack. I didn't think that anything would ever come of it, but it was just a couple of years ago when my wife Tali turned to me as we were starting to plan a family, and she said, "You know, you're such an ardent Yiddishist. Are you really planning on raising children in a world that doesn't have Harry Potter and Yiddish?" And so I couldn't say no to that. And 3 years later, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Harry Potter and der Philosophische Stein, came out. So it's only book 1, but it is a start.
That's great. And Miriam, can you tell me a little bit about how you came to kind of compile this anthology?
Sure. So back to Arun's point that the creativity comes from the lack. So I had a very different way into and through Yiddish. I did not grow up hearing or speaking Yiddish, except I like to say in very stress-inducing, hairy driving situations. And then I would hear, you know, this or that expletive in Yiddish. But it's something that I really discovered as a young adult when I was just about to begin graduate work. And I was really interested in questions of secularization, not just in the Jewish community, but more broadly, what kind of a role did literature play in the process of the Western world becoming more secular? And how is it that literature seemed to retain a special place as a domain where we still engage in moral reasoning, even if we don't necessarily have a religious tradition informing our thinking? So in an American public school, why is your English class where you're most likely to be working through moral dilemmas and questions? That was something that was really of keen interest to me. And it was a suggestion by Ruth Weiss, who ended up being my Dr. Mame, my graduate advisor. She said, you know, secularization took place so rapidly in the Jewish sphere. You could study it so efficiently if you would just go out and learn Yiddish. And I really loved language study. I had spent a couple of years after my undergraduate work in Israel and had studied Hebrew and had very fluent Hebrew. And I had Spanish from growing up in a semi-immersion program in Miami. And I was taking Arabic for fun at the time. And I thought, all right, you know, one more language, let's see what happens. And it turns out that what they say about Yiddish sredt sich, it speaks itself, was kind of true, meaning I found it very intuitive. And the deal was kind of sealed when I was so fortunate as to get a job on the tenure track at Emory University, teaching Yiddish language, literature, and culture. And I started teaching beginners language courses. And looking back to my own experiences of language study and wondering, you know, every other time I learned a language, we read some work of children's literature, and that was never part of my Yiddish education. I wonder if there is any. And I also had children who were, this is in 2013, so my children were 7 years younger than they are now. One of them didn't even exist yet. And I thought, is there anything that's authentic from Yiddish culture that I could hand them in the way of storytelling? Because I was seeing a lot of representations of the shtetl that seemed kind of historically non-specific, and as I came to know more and more about Yiddish culture, even somewhat inaccurate. And so it was really the confluence of these two quests that I was on as a language instructor specifically, and as a mother to young children, that brought me to the doorstep of Yiddish children's literature. And then I saw that it was plentiful, it was rich, and it was even digitized and waiting on the website of the Yiddish Book Center. And it just felt like, okay, well, somebody has to do something with this. And I didn't see anybody doing anything with it on a large scale. So why not me?
In terms of translations, I mean, not just Yiddish, but anytime you do a translation, it's so hard to, you're not just translating the meaning, you're translating the tone and the cultural context. But I think in some ways you two picked like remarkably tough things to translate. I mean, J.K. Rowling has basically like created an entire world with names that are plays on words or evoke all these different references. And then Yiddish, like you were saying, Miriam, is a language, but it also comes with its own, religious, political, cultural context that I think you're expected to know when you kind of, are reading the stories. So maybe let's start with Arun. What were some of the challenges in translating Harry Potter? And maybe you could talk a little bit about, especially what did you do with like the words that were made up that didn't exist?
Yeah. The role of me as the translator in a text like Harry Potter is, it's a very scary line to walk, because frankly, nobody, I mean, maybe some jokers would like to see Herschel Potter, but most people want Harry Potter. They want the Harry Potter that they remember. I know I want the Harry Potter that I remember. I want Hermione. I don't want, Hannah and, Ron being Ruvain. So I want the landscape to look the same, and I want it to feel at home in Yiddish, but I don't want to turn it Jewish. And so it was actually specifically in the realm of made up words from J.K. Rowling's universe building that allowed me some latitude, where these oftentimes are words that rely on some kind of sound symbolism that might harken back to something in, pagan Teutonic or Britain culture. And those were really the places where I was able to kind of sneak in a little bit of Jewish feel or Yiddish feel. So one example would be the golden snitch, which is the smallest ball of 3 balls that are used in the game of Quidditch. And it's this very elegant little ball. It's gold and silver, and it has wings, and it flutters about. And I looked at some of the other translations and to see what they had done with it. And they basically kept the name as snitch. I believe in German it was Schnauz. And I was like, I couldn't do that, because I felt like Yiddish already, people already have the impression at times that Yiddish is such a shma language. And so I really wanted to take a step away from that and think, what feels authentically Jewish and authentically Yiddish, but isn't overtly Jewish in its character. And what I ended up landing on was the formulation, this golden flatterl, which means the golden butterfly, which I thought worked well because the butterfly is actually a recurrent theme in Yiddish literature, and it's particularly a poignant image for my family. The name of the game itself, Quidditch, was another opportunity to insert some Judaism, or rather some Yiddish, because it doesn't mean anything in English either. And I cast about, I could have gone with Quidditch, which would have just been the Yiddishization of Quidditch. But then I remembered that there's this phrase that the Yiddish speakers in the audience, and probably also the Hebrew speakers in the audience, will be familiar with. In Yiddish, the phrase is "As Gott will, shista bezim," which in Hebrew is "Kshe'elokim rotzeh, gam metateh yoreh," which means literally, if God wills it, even a broom can shoot. And I was like, that's perfect. You literally have people zooming around on brooms, shooting balls into hoops. So let's take that phrase, smush it into one word, and that's how we got Schiessbesen, which is shoot broom.
That's great. And Miriam, what were some of the unique aspects of translating these stories from Yiddish to English?
Sure. So one of them is that it's a Honey on the Page ended up being a collection of 47 pieces, and I was trying to represent as much of the diversity of this corpus as possible, geographically, in terms of both where it was published and where it was set, who the authors were, when they were writing. And so there are just a lot of different styles to accommodate. So trying to let that come through, Sholem Ash is a master who sounds very different than Sina Rabinovich, who's also a master. And then a second challenge that I think is really specific to this project is that, as I said, there is a process of inventing a children's literature, and it happened under, like all of modern Yiddish literature, it happened under circumstances of great historical compression, so that we really see this whole arc of not having a Yiddish children's literature to having one in the course of, a decade and a half. But even with that said, it took time to come up with a register for addressing children. So in the teens and in the 20s, we see a lot of lyrical descriptions where things aren't sad or lonely, they're desolate. Well, is this a text for a 12-year-old who should be pushed to learn the word desolate, sometime between now and the SATs? Or is this a story for a 7 or 8-year-old who, if you put desolate in there, it's like, wait, what? So trying to, on the one hand, keep the feeling of these texts, which are of another time and have this kind of otherworldly quality, but at the same time to create something that was going to be an enticing, conceptual and linguistic world for 21st century kids. That was really the challenge I faced.
So this is actually my favorite part of the whole entire Zoominar. I'm hoping you guys could read a little bit from your work. Miriam, perhaps you'd like to go first and introduce the text and explain what it is.
Sure. So I have a sentimental favorite, but if we have time, maybe we'll get to that later. A rhyming poem, but I'd actually like to just start with a little piece of prose that's part of a story by Meisha Kulbach, The Wind That Got Angry. Kulbach was one of the great Soviet Yiddish writers. And one of the reasons or one of the things that I love about this story is that the really fun thing about bringing this literature into English is that sometimes other very creative people do creative things with it that I could never have anticipated. So I taught a mini course at the YIVO Institute in 2015. I'm doing another one now. And I had a student, Linda Elovitz Marshall, who writes children's stories. And she ended up writing an adaptation that she calls Goodnight Wind from this story with these incredible paper cut illustrations by Maël Doliveau. So Goodnight Wind is there. And it's a story that immediately asks the reader to identify with somebody that we're not used to thinking about as any more than a nuisance. And that is a winter wind who is in an incredibly vulnerable situation because spring has come early and there's been a thaw. And if he doesn't find a way out of the city where things are warming up and into the snowy fields of the countryside, he's gonna die. And so our sympathy is with the wind, and he goes to the oak tree and to the rock and to the country inn, trying to find some place of shelter. And he's rejected everywhere as a nuisance. And Kulbach writes, the wind started to feel angry at the entire world. Nobody would let him rest, and he felt terrible. He stood up like a strong man in the middle of a field, rolled up his sleeves, girded his loins, ungegurt gelenden, which sounds as preposterous in Yiddish as it does in English, and began to blow with all his might. The snow flew off the ground and like silver flour began to fall anew. The wind blew at everything as hard as he could. Then he began to whistle, to blow and whistle, whistle and blow, until he had whipped up a whirling, whistling, screaming blizzard. And the snow began to whirl and throw itself about like white handkerchiefs flying in a gale. The wind began to cry. He cried like a child without stopping. Then he began to howl like a dog, and with all the howling, hard-driving snow and screaming, it grew darker than the white snow had ever seen it. The snow scattered through the darkness from the sky down to the ground and from the ground up to the sky. And the wind began to wail like a cat and to cry as cats wail and cry on a dark night. It was a great blizzard. The wind had covered all the roads with snow. The traveling coachmen had to stop their horses. No one could see which way to go. They scrambled down from their laden wagons, slapped themselves under the armpits to keep warm, and exclaimed, "What a storm wind! What a whirlwind! I've never seen such a blizzard."
Oh man, I just want to like listen to you for the rest of the evening. That's awesome.
And I think it's a tantrum story. I think it's a story that is addressing the frustration of the pre-verbal child and not being able to express herself and get her needs met, and the toll that that takes on everyone around her.
I can relate to that. Arun, would you share a little bit from Harry Potter?
Sure. So this is the book. Beautiful, beautiful cover art by Johnny Udel, and actually published by a publishing house in Sweden. That's a long story, perhaps we can get to that later. I'd like to read something definitely on a lighter note, the Sorting Hat song, which is early on in the first book, where the hat is placed successively on each incoming first year's head and determines in which house that student will go. So I'll briefly tell you the names of each of the houses so that you can hear them as they come. I'll read one stanza in English and one stanza in Yiddish. Gryffindor is Golden Griff. Ravenclaw is Robbenkrell. Hufflepuff is Hufflepuff. And Slytherin is Samderin, which literally translates to poison within, because slither is not a Yiddish word. Oh, you may not think I'm pretty, but don't judge on what you see. I'll eat myself if you can find a smarter hat than me. Siz mein Punim nisch ken Schönheit, na de Schönheit gar nisch sagt. Gege find mir noch a Hittel, was a Kopf wie meins vermogt. You can keep your bowlers black, your top hats sleek and tall, for I'm the Hogwarts sorting hat, and I can cap them all. Hey, die Kepke, Kitschme, Kapelich, die Streimel ausgepitzte. Tuh, seid schon Meuchel, ich bin das der same Kimtzinitster. There's nothing hidden in your head the sorting hat can't see. So try me on, and I will tell you where you ought to be. Der Hogwartser Sortierhit weist dein Ätzem in dein Kern, Tom mest mich an in Herr me Venus, wem dit ist gehören. You might belong in Gryffindor, where dwell the brave at heart. Their daring, nerve, and chivalry set Gryffindors apart. Zu Golden Griff gehören die mit Herz galant in Dreist. Sie teilen sich aus mit Gwure, oder was Gwure heißt. You might belong in Hufflepuff, where they are just and loyal. Those patient Hufflepuffs are true and unafraid of toil. Gehörst die wieder Hufflepuff, dem Joischer halt die Teier, mats ne stoiste Horavanya in beständig a Getreier. Or yet in wise old Ravenclaw, if you've a ready mind, where those of wit and learning will always find their kind. Beschert zu sein in Robbenkrell is der mit scharfen Sinnen, wie Unhängers von Wissen in von Klugschaft sich gefinnen. Or perhaps in Slytherin, you'll make your real friends. Those cunning folk use any means to achieve their ends. Sie efscher treffst die echte Freund in Sanderen dem Chitteren. Wie abi dem Ziel der Griechen sinnen kosher alle Mitteln. So put me on, don't be afraid, and don't get in a flap. You're in safe hands, though I have none, for I'm a thinking cap. Totima chunit, schrecklich nicht. Ich leg auf dir kein Hand. Ich bin fort bloß a sortierhot, gar a freundlich Stück gewandt.
Das ist verjiddischt und verbessert. That's improved in the Yiddish.
That was great. If anyone wants more, Suzanne is putting links to buy the books in the chat. I encourage everyone for encore performances to check it out. Let's talk audience, since you mentioned kind of the Swedish publishing house. I'm curious for both of you, what were the intended audiences when you wrote the books, and then kind of what did the audiences actually, what were they actually once it was published?
Arun, your book has been out longer. You want to?
Okay. So yes, the book was published by a Swedish publishing house because, in short, Yiddish ended up somehow, magically, against all odds, becoming a government-funded minority language in Sweden. And so there was funding to get the venture off the ground. Of course, knowing that it was a translation of a book in the Harry Potter series, which is the best-selling book series of all time, not the best-selling book, that would be the Bible. So I knew that there was going to be a fair bit of demand just from Harry Potter collectors. So that was sort of on one extreme, people who don't really know Yiddish, but wanted to have the book on their shelves. And on the other hand, I knew that there were Yiddishists, people who love Yiddish, who were interested in Yiddish, who have warm feelings towards Yiddish, who would also want this, to read it, perhaps even to learn it. And anecdotally, I have heard that a number of people who have been waiting for a long time to learn Yiddish have finally decided this is the time, which gives me a lot of nachas. And then there were, I suppose, the two groups. I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was a little bit surprised. One was a large, surprisingly large number of books were sold to people in Hasidic communities. In fact, one father biked up from Williamsburg during the pandemic for a corona-safe handoff, and it turns out that many of these Hasidic families, first of all, you know, the Amcha, the masses in the Hasidic world are not necessarily as close to the stringent epicenter as we might imagine, but many of these families are bilingual in English, and their kids have read the books in English already. And so having the book in Yiddish was an exciting thing for them, and even for the kids, which, you know, having done this sort of for the kid version of myself and God willing for my own child, that was all I could have asked for. But more broadly, and I think this is a trend that we've been seeing already for the last 10, 20 years, and even more than that, is the segment of the Jewish population that has warm feelings towards Yiddish. Maybe even their parents' generation or their grandparents' generation specifically walked away from Yiddish due to lots of reasons, competing language ideologies in terms of Hebrew, the trauma of the Holocaust and World War II, and generally just the trauma of immigration. But I think many people are now turning back and saying, hey, this is part of my heritage, and I don't have any concrete connection to it into my day-to-day life, but my bookshelf, what's on my bookshelf says something about who I am, and I want it on my bookshelf. So that was really heartwarming to hear from people that they were able to make that connection.
Yeah.
Especially now in the Zoom era, what's on your bookshelf is very important. Miriam, how about you?
So I knew from the beginning that I wanted this to be a book that would be a resource for scholars and other interested adults, but also that would be a book that would appeal to children. Not necessarily that they would go off and read independently, but that I talk in the introduction about the idea of children and adults reading in proximity to one another. So a book that a family can talk about, a book that an educator in a day school or a Sunday school or a Hebrew school can pull a story from. And because I knew that that was a priority, I actually delayed publication so that we could have more time to do more fundraising in order to be able to hire an illustrator. And we ended up with these fantastic sort of cartoonish, whimsical illustrations by Paula Cohen, who also did the cover. This is the rabbi riding the magic lion after they spend a Shabbos together. And this is Prinsa in 1930s Brooklyn, who's just trying to find a quiet place where she can read in peace without her younger sister dragging her home to do chores. And so that was my vision. And it's a little early to tell. The book was published in October, and I understand that it's not always being marketed as a children's book. Some of the larger sellers like Barnes and Noble, they adopted the book, but not into their juvenile department. But then I do have reports and photos from friends walking by independent local bookstores. We have to love our independent local bookstores, where the book was part of a pre-Hanukkah display, or it was otherwise, displayed with children's books. So I think the jury is still out a little bit, but as far as the invitations to speak about the book, those have come from university audiences and Sunday schools and Hebrew schools and, audiences of all ages and denominations and kind of parts of the affiliative spectrum within the Jewish world. So I find that really encouraging.
Well, someone just said, can we see the cover of Honey?
Oh, please.
Wow. And also someone asked about the cover. Oh, someone asked about the name. So you can see that, Honey on the Page.
Oh, so Honey on the Page, sure, is an allusion to the custom of pouring out and spreading honey on the first page of a little boy's primer when he would be taken to the cheder that Arun mentioned earlier, that informal Jewish elementary school, so that the child, as he or she now begins to learn, is really licking up and incorporating the sweetness of the learning experience. The mind and the tongue are both experiencing this sweetness together.
Oh my goodness, I'm just looking at the chat and there's so many good questions. One more question from me before we move to the chat. It's something, Arun, you alluded to, that that Yiddish has become seems to be more popular than ever. Oh, that's probably an arguable statement. But I'm curious if translations to and from Yiddish are more popular than they have been. I definitely see more, Yiddish publishing houses popping up. And why do you guys think that could be? One reason I thought might be, the internet, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Shall I start? Sure. So there's a lot more infrastructure now. The Yiddish Book Center established a translation fellowship that started in 2013. They have a cohort that's now up to about 10 translators every year who are learning the craft of translation, which I was very fortunate to be in the first cohort with this book project. So that's a piece of it. I think that there was a lot of loss and a community that kind of came to the brink and said, oh my goodness, we need to invest in the institutions that are going to allow us to regenerate some of what threatens to be lost forever. So that means Yiddish in language programs, intensive summer programs are popping up like mushrooms after the rain, not only in North America, but in Europe and in Israel. There are just all kinds of opportunities to learn and to become conversant in Yiddish language, and then to access the fruits of Yiddish in translation, whether that is literary translation, theater, music, all kinds of creative endeavors where people are using Yiddish and making the Yiddish accessible to speakers of other languages, especially English.
Arun, is there anything you'd like to add, or?
Yeah, you know, alongside this wonderful flowering of projects of making the corpus of Yiddish literature and folk song and beyond available in Yiddish, we've also been seeing this interesting phenomenon of things being translated into Yiddish. For example, Daniel Kahn translated Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah into Yiddish, an absolutely masterful translation. And that's not the only one. And I think that it generally mirrors a broader recognition that whereas Yiddish may have been ideologically fraught in past generations, it is actually the distance and to some extent the loss of some of that transmission that enables us today as a generation to be able to look back with fresh eyes and say, wow, there's a lot here that we can shep from, that we can draw from, and there's a lot that we can gain from projecting back and even creating in this language.
Tomorrow I'm interviewing the director of a new movie called The Vigil, which is a Yiddish horror film, which I saw it, which is really interesting, but it's, you know, it's a popular, you know, normal horror film. It just is all in Yiddish. So I'm really excited about kind of this creativity that's flowering everywhere. Oh, this is a good question. What kind of contemporary stories are available that feature brainy girls?
So the last story, which is a kind of pride of place because it's where, you know, where symbolically I want to say this literature was going, is the first chapter of a collection of stories called Das Modne Mädel von Brooklyn, no, A Modne Mädel von Brooklyn, an unusual girl from Brooklyn. And her name is Prinsa wo binse, which is a corruption of Prinsa wo bist du, Prinsa, where are you? So I translate that as Prinsa, where are you? And that is the girl who is sitting atop the lamppost trying to find a quiet place to read. Reading is Prinsa's superpower. Whatever is going on in the book that is in her hands at any given moment, and there's always a book in her hands, that's what she perceives to be going on in her real life. So we very quickly get into all sorts of fun, you know, postmodernist thinking about what does it mean for a fictional character to have a real life, but Prinsa does. And I haven't translated the whole thing yet. There's an entire, you know, book of stories about her and her adventures and misadventures that all grow out of this really passionate attachment to the written word. So I would hold up Prinsa as our, you know, first and foremost brainiac girl of Yiddish literature.
That's great. There are a few questions about music. And I'm curious, one person asked, are there any contemporary songs that are translated into Yiddish? I feel like that must be true, but I'd love to hear from people who actually know.
What is there besides Hallelujah?
There is certainly a phenomenon of people with varying levels of proficiency taking Beatles songs and a lot of these other classic songs and translating them into Yiddish. I think I wouldn't say that there is an industry, but I think that there is certainly a trend of people finding meaning in that mode of expression.
Yeah, there's also so much richness in Yiddish music, and there's a kind of revival going on. So I think in that arena, we might not be as dependent in a way on translation. Like people are really accessing and enjoying Yiddish music with Yiddish words.
Yeah, I think that I saw this in some of the comments in the chat as well. but there is, I don't think anybody can argue that we can subsist on translation alone, and that again we're shepping, we're drawing water and lifeblood from this source, and in order for that to stay relevant, you also have to be able to interact with it as it is. And music is an amazing way to do that, because you don't necessarily have to learn a language to fluency in order to be able to communicate with it and be in conversation with it.
Yeah.
And I see in the discussion there's some talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin, which Arun, you mentioned at the beginning of the talk. One thing that's interesting that you also mentioned was this idea of like improving upon the Yiddish, this sort of English or secular story. So maybe you could talk a little bit about a few examples of that. I know Shakespeare is an example of where the writers improved upon the story, and Uncle Tom's Cabin is another example.
I certainly can't speak as an expert here, but I'll say briefly that I think maybe in more modern times we may look at translations with more scrutiny, and whereas in past times, I'm thinking about the kind of literature that was published en masse in Yiddish for the Yiddish-speaking masses who didn't speak English or the Spanish of Don Quixote. And my personal sense is that in those cases, the translator had a little bit more latitude, and it really kind of depends on the chutzpah of the translator in terms of whether they want to simply abridge, cut out parts that they felt were boring, or as in Uncle Tom's Cabin, where you see what I would call some of the attempts questionable, but ways of really imposing a Jewish framework in terms of Jewish names or Jewish values into the text, much the way that was done with the Bava Buch almost 500 years earlier. So I think you have both. And I also think that our understanding of what translation is supposed to do today may be quite different than what it may have been 100 years ago, or certainly 500 years ago.
That's a nice place, I think, to end. One last question is, people have asked, is the audiobook available for either of your books?
Not yet for me.
I'm working currently on just getting the translation of the second book out. But after that, we're hoping to do a full audiobook of the first book. But chapter 1 is available on YouTube. I believe that Suzanne sent it out in the chat. I will find that and send it out as well. And perhaps we can also have it in the email that goes out as the recap. But it's only chapter 1.
And
well, that's something. Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, Suzanne.
You're still muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Sarah and Arun and Miriam. This was absolutely wonderful. I think there's been a lot of requests for various books that people would like to see translated. So Arun, you have your work cut out for you. I know, Miriam, there's been requests for you to read your book to people's schools. So I really hope the conversation continues. Yes, please use the links in the chat where you can purchase both of their books, and we'll send it out again in the follow-up email along with the link to view the first chapter in Yiddish. And I want to just remind everybody to sign up for next week's Zoominar on what to do about anti-Semitism and racism with Eric K. Ward next week. And if you've enjoyed this program, we kindly ask that you consider making a donation to Moment Magazine on our website so that we can continue having programs like this for you in the future. Again, thank you all for such a wonderful presentation. Thank you everybody for coming, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.